This is the second part of Chapter 33 notes to take over spring break, so we are caught up at the end of the year. We left off, we went through the first set of notes, covered all of the first New Deal and Roosevelt getting elected. This set is going to cover the second New Deal, leading us all the way up to the end of the New Deal. So the second New Deal comes around before Roosevelt's second term of office, so it really begins about 1935. And it's the second set of programs. We already saw the first set of programs, which started to begin being struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935, like the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. But Roosevelt is going to start a second round in 1935 of administrations. And this is a continuation and sometimes an expansion of the first New Deal. And it all starts with the Works Progress Administration, called the WPA. It's going to be run by a guy named Harry Hopkins. He is one of FDR's good friends. And he's going to be important in World War II because he's also Winston Churchill, one of Winston Churchill's best friends. So he's going to be kind of the messenger between FDR and Churchill during World War II. But he's running the WPA. Now, in the first New Deal, we had the PWA. And that was where we were giving money out to the states for infrastructure. And the WPA is going to be like the PWA, but on steroids. Okay, so the Public Works Administration on steroids. And it takes over for the Public Works Administration. It expands it. It's creating a huge federal employment agency. It's a much more massive program. So they're not only giving money out, they're also bringing a lot of people in to work for the government. Now, to do this, they're not just building infrastructure anymore. They do a lot of that as well. But they're also appointing artists, musicians, and actors to use their talents. Now, the idea is this. If you have a concert pianist with a very high level of skills, like he was playing in the symphony orchestra in New York City and Carnegie Hall, are you better off giving him a shovel and letting him go build a school, or are you better off letting him use his talents as a concert pianist? And so Hopkins and the Works Progress Administration decides that we should use people's talents. Okay, we should not just give everybody a shovel. We should actually use people's talents where they are. And so they're going to give concerts for free in parks so that people can come and listen. The whole idea behind this is it's going to raise morale. If you're just working and working and working and you don't have any fun in your life because there's no fun provided, people's morale is not going to be so good. So it's raising morale as well as using the talents of the artists and musicians. Artists are going to create murals in schools and post offices. Actors are going to put on plays in public settings for people to watch, and they're all paid for by the federal government, not only to employ those people, but to raise morale for the common people in the U.S. Because it's been a really tough kind of few years. So this agency is going to be huge. They're going to spend billions and billions of dollars, but it does a lot of good for the people coming out of the Depression. This is getting into the idea of Keynesian economics, or deficit spending, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, we're also going to see in 1935 the National Labor Relations Act pass, which is also known as the Wagner Act. This makes it legal for unions to organize and to collectively bargain. It makes it illegal for businesses to deny the rights for workers to unionize. So a business has to allow workers to unionize, and unions can organize and collectively bargain with the owners of a company for better pay, better working conditions, things like that. And this is the first major step we see where the government is fully switching sides from pro-business to pro-labor. And so it's going to be instrumental in boosting labor unions' regrowth, because we saw them kind of decrease a little bit in the 1920s. Now we're seeing labor unions come back again. We also see the Rural Electrification Administration formed. We've talked about the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which Roosevelt sees as an opportunity and a success. And he sees the REA as the Tennessee Valley Authority on a much bigger scale. So the Rural Electrification Administration is going to provide power to about 90% of rural communities that don't have it. At this time, in the 1920s and 30s, farmers don't have electricity. They're still using oil lamps at night and things like that. And so this is providing farmers with that electricity. And this is also a direct charge to, or direct challenge to private electricity companies. And they're going to have to try and fight back against this. Roosevelt is basically going to say, deal with it. We are your competition. You need to compete with us. And so that's going to make a lot of electricity companies much more competitive because the federal government is now creating this administration. We're also going to see FDR raise taxes on the wealthy, his original people. Okay, Hoover actually did it too, from about 25% to 60%. So if you see the stock market crash, Hoover raised taxes, this line up, and then we're going to see FDR raise taxes again, and then World War II starts and FDR is still in power, still president, so we're going to see him raise taxes again, and so it's going to get pretty high. FDR's belief is that the rich can pay more. And so we're going to see the progressive income tax from the 16th Amendment expanded, and taxes are going to become much more severe as the structure changes. Now, it's still a bracket system, so you pay a certain percentage based on how much you make. So it's not like he's charging 90% taxes on someone who's making $5 an hour. But under FDR, the highest tax bracket is going to pay approximately 90% in taxes. That's 9 out of every $10 going back to the federal government. And this is where the wealthy are going to call FDR a traitor to his class. He was raised with these people, and yet he's, raising taxes on them. But very few people are going to fit in that bracket. These are the Carnegies and the Rockefellers that have this 90%. Everybody else is probably more around 50 to 60%, which is still a lot. But at this time, this is kind of how it's working. When Reagan comes into office, taxes for the wealthiest are about 70%. You can see over here on this chart, Reagan takes office, 70%. And he's going to lower them down to 38% by the time he is out of office. Bush is going to further lower it to 34%. Bush number 1, George H.W. Bush. Obama, and then by the time we get to President Obama in 2008, it's going to be around 37%. Or it was actually around, I think, 35%. Obama wanted to raise it to 37%, but didn't get it. During the 2012 election, Romney wanted to decrease it to 15% for the wealthiest. So this is the top marginal rate. This is for the wealthiest in America, top like 2% of Americans. Chances are not many of us have to ever pay this amount. I never will pay this amount because I'm a teacher. We don't make a lot of money. And now the Ryan budget, or the latest one that has been proposed and passed in the House, but not yet the Senate, has proposed a 35% tax rate for those making over $379,000 per year. So we'll see it's another one of those. We'll see what happens. So people in the Great Depression in the 1920s, 30s, are not so happy with FDR. His name becomes a dirty name for the rich, as they are very frustrated with him raising taxes so much on the wealthy. And then the next thing that comes along as part of the second New Deal is going to be the Social Security Act. This is going to be important because it's more than what we just know as Social Security. It's the idea that the elderly in society, the 65-year-old and older, will get a pension from the federal government for the rest of their lives, as long as they live. Now, it's about $24 per month in that time's money, which is not a lot even back then. And then it was for those over 75 when the average lifespan was about 65. So very few people actually got Social Security in 1935 when it was originally founded. Social Security today has been changed, so it's not only for the elderly, it's also for the unemployed. If you're laid off of your job, then you're eligible for the government to give you a certain amount of money until you find a new job, as long as you are actively searching. So it's not like you sit on the couch and do absolutely nothing and the government's going to give you money. You have to have a certain number of, like, you're putting your resume out there, you're applying for jobs, you're actively searching for jobs. So don't think that it's just I sit on the couch and do nothing and I get money from the government. It doesn't work like that. So these programs become called entitlement programs. It's supposed to be a social safety net for the American population. So for example, 2 years ago when I first moved to Madison High School, I left Rockingham County because there were severe budget cuts. And even though all of the teachers got great recommendations and reviews, the school board didn't have enough money to pay all of the teachers. And so in my last year, one teacher from every single department was let go. And if that teacher couldn't find a job anywhere else, then they would go to the unemployment office and they would get about $300 a week, or about $1,600 a month, which is about enough, hopefully enough for you to live on until you can find another job. In some areas, that's not enough for people to live on, but hopefully it helps you kind of survive until you can find that new job. So it's going to cover Social Security covers the elderly, it covers the unemployed, and it also covers the disabled. So if a child is born mentally disabled, then the child is going to get a small amount of money to help pay for someone to take care of them. Once they reach the age of 18 and they are, fully recognized as an adult. So that way they can help pay for someone to take care of them so they don't become known as a burden on society, they don't become homeless, they don't have to go to a group home, they get a little bit of money so that way people can help care for them. So there are two reasons that Social Security is started. The first one is to make sure that elderly don't end up living in poverty. And the second one is think of the reason behind the CCC. How we are taking these young men out of the city to go work in camps out west doing forestry and stuff like that, so that way the people in the city who had families to provide for could get jobs. And so the idea behind Social Security is that it's allowing older people to retire so that their jobs are opened up for the next generation. If you don't have this, then the elderly feel like they have to keep working until they end up dying, because otherwise there's nothing to pay for them, especially if your retirement savings were in a bank account and that was completely lost during the Great Depression. So this allows more jobs to be freed up. Now, if you're born in the U.S., you should have a Social Security card, and you should know your Social Security number. That's going to be one of the most important numbers you ever need. And you see John Doe over here is zeros all across. Your card would have a very special number that is the only number just for you. Today, there are discussions about whether Social Security will be around, when you all get old, and when I get older. And what's the difference between back then and now? Well, in the 1930s, when it was first started, you had about 20 people paying into the system with their monthly checks for every one person who got money, because lifespan was a lot shorter and a lot of people didn't get Social Security. Today, the amount is about 3 to 1. Okay, so 3 people paying into the system. So I'm currently paying into the system every single month with my paycheck. And my grandparents get a small amount of Social Security because they're over 65 and they have retired. And so it's gotten a lot smaller. So, you know, my brother, myself, and one of my cousins is paying for one of my grandparents, essentially. By the time you guys retire, it's supposed to be about 1 to 1. Okay, so you guys are assuming you're going to work past 2040. You'll be paying about 1 to 1. So if you get $2,000 per month on Social Security, and it's 1 to 1, every single person in America working will be paying for something else. So something has to change, and that's one of the big fights in Congress right now. Whether the retirement age goes up, or taxes go up, or the benefits go down, or all of the above. Another one of those, we'll see what happens. So that's Social Security, something you need to know about. Now, we're also going to see the 1936 election come along. We're going to cover this real fast. Roosevelt wins. Al Landon is going to run against Roosevelt. He loses. It's a very dominating victory. You can see Al Landon gets about 8 electoral votes. He does get about 36% of the popular vote, but again, that is because of the people who vote along party lines. And some people, especially the wealthy, were not so happy with Roosevelt and what he was doing. So we're going to see Roosevelt's second term continue after the 1936 election, and this is going to Roosevelt sees this as a mandate from the people that people like his New Deal programs, and so they're going to continue. But some people are not so happy with Roosevelt, and so there are a bunch of opponents of the New Deal. Now, liberal opponents are arguing that he's not doing enough for the poor, he's taking care of the businesses, he's not taking care of the little man. People on the right, the conservatives, are going to say he's not, he's doing too much, he's spending too much, he's helping the poor too much, he's not helping businesses much. When Roosevelt came into office in 1933, business leaders actually joined with him because they were afraid that big government was going to be overthrown. It would become a communist country and capitalism would die, kind of like what happened in Russia. But FDR goes on record saying that he's the best friend capitalists will ever have, because without changing the industry and the way that business and labor relate to each other, industry would die. And there's some truth to this, because around the world we're seeing the rise of Hitler. France is almost going to become a communist country, but eventually they're able to defeat the communists in their republic. So we see all this crazy stuff happening around the world, and big business owners are going to get together, and they actually form the American Liberty League. Once the New Deal has come in, they form the American Liberty League. And they're going to try to marshal support against Roosevelt because of this whole, he's not helping business enough, he's helping the poor too much, this is too much of a socialist idea. And so, you know, Roosevelt is under attack from all sides. And of course, after the 1936 election, he's going to see that as a mandate, and he's going to say, yeah, they hate me, but I'm going to say, bring it on. Now, we also have some groups, some people that we call demagogues. And these are three characters that come in popularity with the American people in a very similar way that Roosevelt did. They do it with the radio. Now, you're probably wondering what a demagogue is. A demagogue is a political leader or someone who comes into power or gets a lot of attention by seeking support of people, appealing to popular desires and prejudices. So they're not using rational arguments in order to gain support. So Hitler would be a demagogue for sure. These men are coming into popularity through the use of the radio, especially a guy named Father Collin. Collin is a New Deal supporter, and he is a Catholic priest. You see him over here in the picture. And he's probably, he probably has the equivalent to, in audience numbers, to Rush Limbaugh. So he has millions of people listening to his radio program. And he starts supporting the New Deal, but then eventually he kind of turns. And he starts saying that Roosevelt has not gone far enough. Father Collin wants social justice. He wants equality for all. And then he starts adding some very anti-Semitic things, so very anti-Jewish things. Eventually, the Catholic Church is going to censor him because the Catholic Church is not supposed to be involved in politics in this way, particularly. So they're going to tell Father Collin to stop, give your radio show to someone else. And so he kind of fades away into the background. But he becomes a major speaker originally for the New Deal and then against the New Deal as he thought it wasn't doing enough. Our next demagogue is going to be Dr. Francis Townsend, the picture in the middle. He is an elderly physician, and he's an advocate for Social Security before FDR even passed the idea of Social Security. But Francis Townsend wants $250 per month at that time to be given to elderly. But that amount is unstable or unsustainable. And that's a lot of money when the minimum wage for the U.S. is currently 40 cents per hour. But Francis Townsend is going to be very influential in the Social Security program because Roosevelt has a program like that in the works. And when it comes out, Townsend has been pushing for that. And when Roosevelt comes out with the official plan of Social Security, Townsend is going to lose a lot of power. So the big thing to remember with Townsend is $250 per month. Now the third guy is really interesting. He's named Huey Long, and he is called the Kingfish. He was originally governor of Louisiana and became a senator from Louisiana. And essentially, as governor and then later senator, he basically runs the entire state. So it's kind of a party boss system. So he's essentially the boss tweed of the entire state of Louisiana. So every sheriff that is elected, every judge that is chosen, every senator that's picked to run, he makes all those decisions. This is why they call him the Kingfish. He's the big guy in the state. He kind of sees himself as a modern-day Robin Hood. He wants to share the wealth. He wants to tax the rich 100%, take all of the money made in America, put it into a pool, and give $5,000 to every family in America every month. Now, financially, this is not possible. And when Roosevelt hears about this, he says that's the dumbest thing he's ever heard. You can't do it even if you put all of the money in America together. But of course, Long doesn't explain how he's going to do this, other than the whole tax the rich 100%, to his followers. He just says that he's going to do it, and if you're in poverty, $5,000 every month sounds like a really good thing. So he gets millions of followers. He was a Roosevelt supporter during the first New Deal, but then he launches his 1936 presidential campaign, because he wants to be president, and Roosevelt is afraid that Long will pull enough votes away if allowed, and allow Alf Landon to win. So FDR calls Long the second most dangerous man in America. Now, Long doesn't end up running for president because during the primaries, some man jumps out of a crowd and shoots him in the stomach, and Huey Long ends up dying. So Roosevelt's kind of sad about it, but not really, because he doesn't have a competitor in the election, and he wins an overwhelming majority. Now, you're probably wanting to ask who Roosevelt thinks is the first most dangerous man in America, and he thinks it's Douglas MacArthur. Because Douglas MacArthur has the charisma, the ego, and the backing to become a dictator, and he controls the army, because he's in the army. So FDR is kind of thinking, I need to watch MacArthur. So Roosevelt is facing a lot of opponents to his New Deal program, and some who think they can do it better than he can. Now, after the 1936 election, which he sees as a mandate, he's going to make a huge error during his second term. And this becomes the biggest error of his presidency. He's pretty unhappy in 1935 with all the Supreme Court decisions that outlaw or make unconstitutional his New Deal programs. Okay, they said that the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, and the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, are unconstitutional. Now, on the bench, the Supreme Court justices are predominantly conservatives because the Republicans have been in power for the 12 years previous, except for a little bit with Wilson, and they had been the ones to choose all of these justices. And so the justices are conservative, and they're at odds with Roosevelt. But Roosevelt comes up with a plan. He attacks them first directly by saying that these guys are making everything unconstitutional, it's hurting the American people, and we're going to fight back. And he says this in a radio speech. And then he comes flat out and he challenges them in public in 1936. And when he wins the election, he thinks the American people are behind him, and he has a mandate to reorganize the court system. So Roosevelt says in a very smooth way that the justices are overworked, they're very, very tired, and we have 6 justices of the 9 over the age of 70. And he says that for every justice that is over 70, he should get to appoint another justice to help them with their workload. Because when you get older, you start to slow down. And this is all an idea for their sake. And it's for their sake we should increase the productivity of the court by appointing new ones. Well, who's going to appoint these justices? Roosevelt says, well, I guess I'm president, so I guess I will. And so Roosevelt essentially wants to change the makeup of the Supreme Court by adding the number of justices, by adding 6 justices. So instead of 9 justices, we would have 15. And of course, he would appoint liberal justices who would say that his programs are constitutional. So Roosevelt takes this idea on the road, and even though his New Deal programs have been struck down, and it's always by a small majority, it's always 5-4 decisions. And so what happens? The Democrats say no to this court-packing program. They say this is one step closer to a dictatorship. We do not want the checks and balances of the United States set up in the Constitution destroyed. And so Roosevelt and the bill that he pushes through the courts, or through Congress, gets defeated. But a very odd thing happens after this. Those 5-4 decisions against him suddenly start to go 5-4 for Roosevelt. One justice starts changing his votes. For example, a few months before the Wagner bill, this labor unions bill, is seen as unconstitutional. But when it finally gets up to the Supreme Court, the one justice changed his vote and said, no, I actually think this is constitutional. And better yet, for Roosevelt, the justices that are over the age of 70, what are they going to do? Most of them actually retire. They don't drop dead, which is what I expected you to say. And so when they retire, who gets to appoint their replacements? The president does. And so Roosevelt is going to be president for almost 12 years. And Truman is going to be president for about 7 years, his follower, who's also a Democrat. And so they have about 20 years of Democrats controlling the presidency, which means by the time and appointing new Supreme Court justices, so by the time the 1950s come around, we're going to have a very liberal Supreme Court. And this liberal Supreme Court is going to end up facing all of the daunting issues of the 1950s and 60s, like Brown versus Board. And the Supreme Court is going to be much more liberal. Now, today, because of, Reagan and all of the conservative presidents during the 1980s and early 90s, we have a much more conservative Supreme Court. Today, 5 of the 9 justices were appointed by Republican presidents. So it's usually about a 5-9 conservative swing on the court. Obama has been able to make 2 appointments during his terms so far. Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan have been the 2 justices he has appointed. And then 4 of the current justices are in their 70s today. So we'll see what happens, whether he can appoint more in the next 3 years of his second term, or whether they end up holding out and the next president in the election of 2016 gets to appoint them. So this is the big fight in the 1930s with Roosevelt. It's not successful in changing the makeup of the court. That sounds like a very radical idea. But you have to remember that when the Constitution was written, we had 5 justices. And then we went to 7, and then finally 9. So it's not really that radical of an idea to change it, but the way Roosevelt tried to do it was pretty shady. And people weren't really happy with it. And this is going to kind of start to make people frustrated with Roosevelt. But eventually it turns out all right. We're going to stop the video there and make a third one.